Thank you. It is a pleasure to be back here today and talking about this particular topic with you. And yes, I do see some of you who have Y chromosomes sitting here in the room, so welcome. Glad that you could join us for this session. I'm just curious, as we start into the topic, how many of the women in the room have a formal women's ministry at their church? Okay. Are you involved in it? Keep your hand up. This is not like a public shaming, don't worry. Okay, good. And then how many of the women in this room do not have a formal women's ministry at their church? Okay, all right. So today I kind of want to talk to both of those groups. When we come to a place of understanding women as essential to the mission of the church, we have to answer this question of what should we do about women's ministry. So of course, I could have talked for 3 days on understanding women as essential to the mission of the church, but I don't have 3 days. It's obvious in the scriptures that men and women are necessary for both the cultural mandate of Genesis chapter 1 to be fulfilled, that whole be fruitful and multiply thing that was back there. And then also its New Testament extension, or you could even say amplification. The Great Commission is also given equally to both men and to women, which means that those of us who are in the local church, in addition to having to grapple with what does this look like with regard to foreign missions and what does it look like with regard to women in the culture at large, we have to ask the question of how is the church equipping and deploying women to be equal partners in the ministry of sharing the gospel with all people. Now, equal partners, but hey, we're complementarians, right? So not interchangeable partners. And so that's what we want to take a look at today a little bit. There was an article written in 2011 by Sarah Bessey, and it was entitled, "Why the Church Doesn't Need Women's Ministry." And the women's was in quotes. Did you guys happen to read that? She basically walked through all of her worst nightmare stories about attending women's ministry events. And I have to say that as I read it, I was both nodding my head yes and cringing internally. And here is why. About 10 years ago, I was serving as the women's ministry director at a fairly large Southern Baptist church in the Houston area. And it was my job to plan the kinds of events that this woman was talking about in her article. So yes, I planned a brunch called Hats Off to Women. We all wore hats. The keynote had to talk about the many hats that women wear. The whole theme was hat themed. Yeah, and I just kept thinking, okay, I'm not really getting this, but this is what women want, so I'm going to keep doing it. Additionally, I was beginning to start speaking at different people's retreats, and I remember of the many, and there have been many interesting themes that I have gotten to see fleshed out in everything from the light fixtures all the way down to your pen. There was one that was a carnival-themed event, and I am not kidding. The centerpieces on the tables were ceramic clowns. I still wake up in a cold sweat screaming at night, thinking they were like, "Here, would you like to take one home?" No, I would not. As the women's ministry director, I got emails and mailers of women hoping that I would have them come speak at our church. One woman was a ventriloquist. She had a little Charlie Chaplin dummy, and they sang songs, and they did all kinds of things. And so I know what it is that women are thinking when they think about women's ministry, and they think, huh? And I think the bigger liability as women's ministry really is at a place where it is sort of trying to find what's next, is that not just the women in many churches are questioning its validity, but also the men. And I think it's important because of that we take a look at this with some serious thought and ask the question that I think is being asked by many: is women's ministry necessary? And I want to make sure that I define women's ministry for you clearly so that you don't think I'm asking, are ceramic clowns necessary? The answer is no. And if you have a clown collection and you come up to me after this, I am going to apologize and hug you. Beg your forgiveness. I am defining women's ministry as gender-specific discipleship opportunities and mechanisms for discipleship within the church. That's what I'm talking about. Now, what that might look like in any individual context is kind of up for grabs. And that's what I want you to be thinking about as you're thinking about your particular church is, in my context, how can I think about these things in ways that help whatever our women's ministry looks like be something that is calling and equipping women to fulfill their role in the Great Commission and in the cultural mandate. So in order to get there, I think we have to ask two more questions. In order to figure out, is women's ministry necessary? We need to ask these two questions. And the first is, what do women need to receive uniquely from the body of believers? What do women need to receive uniquely from the body of believers? And then secondly, what do women contribute uniquely to the body of believers? So what do they need from the church, and what does the church need from them? Those are the two things that I want us to spend a little time thinking about. Now, because we're complementarians, we understand that we are not the same, but that we are interdependent, that we need one another. And what this means is that there can be no such thing as a church in which men thrive and women do not, or vice versa. There can be no such thing as a church in which women thrive and men do not. If one languishes, then the other is not truly healthy. So often you might come across a church, and I do as I travel around and speak, and then the women who are in my study, I have over 58 churches that are represented in the enrollment in my study this semester. So I'm drawing on what I hope is a broad experience of what the church looks like today when I make these comments. And you will find churches that have a thriving women's ministry program. It's almost like a church within a church, right? And then there's just like nothing for the men. Or vice versa, you have churches in which the men are doing all kinds of fantastic things and the women feel like they're just kind of over here to the side with nothing that's really happening that is unique for them. Now, because we are complementarians, because we affirm that men and women share the sameness of being created in the image of God, but also these wonderful differences as well, it would make no sense for us to say that we are different but then disciple men and women as though we are the same. It would make no sense at all. So I would say that right there is the first good argument for why there ought to be some gender-specific ministry happening in our churches. Though we share a great commonality as image bearers and co-heirs of grace, we do differ in key ways, both relationally and physically. And this is because each gender is designed to make indispensable contributions to the life of the church. Make sure you heard that word, indispensable. I often talk to women who feel that their contributions in the church are considered to be nice but not necessary. And this is something that I would love to see change. Women's contributions need to be seen instead as essential and indispensable, not an add-on after the serious work of ministry has been done elsewhere. So it's important for us to understand then, what is it that women contribute in addition to just what do women need from the church? So let's talk about some of these relational differences between men and women. These are things that I think would be broadly recognizable within any setting. So if you were, actually I ripped these off from Psychology Today, if you want to know the truth. So as much as people around us want to say, oh no, men and women are interchangeable, it's interesting to me that the social sciences just keep coming back and saying, nuh-uh. So listen to this list. See if you would attest to the truth of this. Women value rapport, right? We value the way that we relate to other people. We think hard about how we're perceived in a conversation. Men, on the other hand, value report. I'm just going to say it and we're going to do it. There's not a whole lot of nuance all the time. And these, again, are general categories. So if you're a woman who's like, what? I think rapport is dumb. I just say what I want. Well, first of all, I can't relate to you at all. And secondly, it's okay. We're not trying to paint with so broad a brush that there's no room for any variation on these. But generally, women value rapport, men value report. Women value supportiveness, okay? Men value dominance. It's not me. Psychology Today said this. Next, women value building relationships, while men tend to value individuality. Women ask questions. Men actually tend to avoid questions, according to this study. Women cooperate, men assert. Women are holistic, Men are focused. Women seek consensus. Have you ever been on a committee of women? It is a killer. Well, I don't know. What do you think? Okay, is everybody okay? Are y'all okay with that decision? Okay, well, let's just do it this way. I'm sorry. You're not sorry. You're just trying to smooth over that you just made the decision for everybody, right? We can spend so much time churned up into reaching consensus that the decision is very hard to get to. Men, on the other hand, rather than seek consensus, they tend to give orders. They give directives. They say, this is what's next. Let's go do it. Women tend to relate, whereas men tend to resolve. Okay, these are just some general points, things that are generally true of one gender versus the other. But please understand that I'm not setting up for you a picture of one gender versus the other. I'm trying to paint a picture of you for what it means, how these two can work together so that the church is moving forward, utilizing the strengths of both of these types of relational styles. Because either of these types of relational styles, left to its own devices, can degrade into something that is sinful or can exalt into something that is beneficial to the body of believers. But they are not intended to operate in isolation. They are intended to operate together. Men and women are both moral, but they are differently so. Now, that means that we form moral judgments in different ways. Men tend to think hierarchically about them. Women tend to think relationally about them. So there's a study done, right, that talks about how if you took a little boy and a little girl and you presented the same case to them where a man's wife is dying of an illness and so he cannot get her prescription because he doesn't have any money. So what does he do? He goes and he steals the medicine that she needs. And you ask the little boy, well, what should happen to the man who stole the medicine? And the little boy says, well, the law says that the man should go to jail because he stole. And then you ask the little girl, what should happen to the man because he stole the medicine for his wife? And the little girl says, well, it's really important because his wife takes care of the children and so does he. And she starts looking at it from a relational standpoint. Is there any way we could ask the judge for leniency? So they're both dealing with a moral dilemma in two very different ways. Which way is more correct? Neither of them. They're both trying to get to justice. They're coming at it from different angles. Men and women have emotions. Both genders have emotions, but we use them differently. So one of the things that I hear a lot, when you talk about women are weaker vessels is, women think this about themselves. Women are weaker emotionally than men. This cracks me up because I keep thinking, well, okay, I've watched a lot of football games, and I've never thrown the remote at the TV. Never. So you tell me, who's more emotional, right? Men can get in touch with their emotions pretty quick under the right circumstances. It's not that men lack emotions, they handle their emotions in a different way than women do. Which one is weakness and which one is strength? If men tend to suppress their emotions, is that a weakness? Well, it could be. Or it could be a mechanism to help them keep moving when things get difficult. If women are more in touch with their emotions than men, is that a weakness or a strength? Well, it could be either, depending on the circumstance. Men and women may both be doctors, but they will approach medicine in different ways. Men and women may both be politicians, but they will approach politics in different ways. On a side note, I don't usually talk about these things. I usually talk about Bible literacy. And so all week long, what do you think has been ringing in my ears? 2 Corinthians, 2 Corinthians, 2 Corinthians. Oh, dear Lord in heaven. Okay, so we differ relationally. Men and women differ relationally, but we also, newsflash, differ physically. As I've already pointed out, women are weaker than men, but that weaker vessel reference, I would say, is only relating to women being, generally speaking, physically weaker than men. We are not intellectually weaker. We may process things intellectually differently. We are not emotionally weaker. We may process our emotions differently. We are not spiritually weaker, although for many, many years it was taught in the church that women were more prone to certain sins than others. But if we are to be co-heirs of grace, then we need to be implicated co-heirs in the fall. And so although our sins may manifest in different ways, we are not more prone to sin than men are. So it is a reference to physical weakness. Generally speaking, women are weaker than men. Now, we understand because of this something intuitively that many men lose sight of as they enter into adulthood. Women, because we are generally physically weaker, understand powerlessness intuitively in a way that men may not. We understand powerlessness intuitively in a way that men may not. Men move out of a phase of life in which they understand powerlessness as they grow in physical strength. But women, we don't outgrow that. You know how I know this? I took a straw poll, really sophisticated, a lot of science involved, where I asked a whole bunch of men one question, and I said, when you walk down a dark alley, what are you thinking and what are you doing? And they were like, huh? So I went and talked to more men. When you walk down a dark alley, what are you thinking about? What are you doing? Getting to my destination, looking for my car. Now, if I were to ask the women in this room, when you walk down a dark alley, what are you thinking about? What are you doing? What are you going to say to me? Because you and I, women, we grew up with people giving us absolutely inane advice about what to do when you are walking down a dark alley. Well, I'm putting my keys between my fingers so that I can make some nunchucks if I need to, if someone is going to come after me, or I'm checking all around, I'm making sure that I'm looking everywhere, or I've got my pepper spray in my purse, or I've got my flashlight, or whatever it is, my stun gun. If you're in Texas, I don't even want to know what you've got in your purse. Seriously, it is out of control. And so we have this thing. I will tell you, you know what someone told me? Hey, you know what? Your upper body strength is not going to do you any favors. And so if you're attacked, you should drop to your back and kick like a rabbit. What? Men and women are different. Women are physically weaker than men, generally speaking, and because of that, we understand powerlessness intuitively in a way that men may not. I'm going to come back to that idea. Just hold on to it for now. Second way that women are different from men physically is that women are life givers in the sense that we are able to carry and nurture an unborn child and then nurture a born child after it has been born. Women, because of our physiology, have a unique and deeply personal vantage point on the gospel that men just can't. Now, I'm not saying that men are missing out on anything. I think there are vantage points that men have on the gospel that women probably don't either. But if you think about it, women, and my apologies to the Y chromosomes in the room at this moment, but every 28 days, women, your body tells a parable about the shedding of blood for the renewing of life. That's the gospel, bearing witness in your flesh. I want to say that a man can understand that, but I kind of hope he can't, because that'd be weird. Think about how often birth language shows up in the Bible. I always laugh when someone's doing the announcements at church, a man, and he'll say, and we're birthing a new ministry, and I want to go, no. You need to choose a different metaphor, unless there's something about you we don't know. Now, obviously, metaphors, Jesus uses the metaphor, so it's fair game for Ben. But when we hear birth language, when we hear about the new birth, it hits us in a different way than it does a man. When I read, in him we live and move and have our being, it reminds me of a precious time when I carried a child and of how safe that child was during that time. So think about this. Not only are women weaker than men, generally speaking, but because women are able to bear a child, we also have a biologically programmed period of weakness in our makeup, because who's weak when they're pregnant? All of us. I'm sorry, when I was 9 months pregnant, I was not going to do a roundhouse kick and drop anybody, even if I had a black belt in Taekwondo. If I had dropped to my back and rabbit kicked 9 months pregnant, what? So we have this biologically designed period of weakness, and I think this too shows us a picture in a way that perhaps a man can't understand the same way that a woman can. Think about this. As a woman, right, I am a strong person, and then I become weak for a determined period of time. I deliver another into life by the shedding of blood. And then I am restored to my former strength, and I live to intercede for that new life. Does that sound like anything? Philippians 2. So because we are women, we have a unique vantage point on the gospel. And I think that men do as well, but I didn't put that in my notes today. We'll have to get them to tell us what it is at another time. So now, in light of these differences, these relational differences and these physical differences, how can we look at this question of what it is that women need from the church? What do women need most from the church? First, I would say that women need to be shepherded. Women need to be shepherded. Now, because women are different from men, I think sometimes the men can kind of be like, I don't know what they're doing. I just want them to go do it. And I'm going to put a woman over that who I trust, and she understands. She's the interpreter. Now you go and make them do the things with the clowns and the decorations. But as women who are leaders in our church, or as women who have influence over the way that our women in the church are led, we need to know what is shaping the thinking of the women who are in our churches. You guys, you women, are going to have a better read on that than most of the men in your church are going to, and they might need your help. So, for example, what voices are most women listening to? I could make a list of 10 women voices off the top of my head. Can you? Who are some of the women voices that women are listening to? Beth Moore, Christine Kane, Lisa Turkhurst. Who else is out there? Nancy Lee DeMoss. Okay, so here they start to come, right? And so there are these women whose voices are speaking into the lives of our women, some of them loudly, some of them subtly. Sarah Young, who wrote Jesus Calling. That's another voice that a lot of women, if you want to know the voices that are speaking into women's lives, go out to Instagram and dig around. And you'll see, because they're quoting them and they're writing what they've journaled about what these women have said. And so I'm not here today to tell you which of those voices I love or don't love. I'm here today to tell you that it's our job as those who lead the church to shepherd our women toward voices that are reliable and that will point them to truth. And so if we don't know who the women are that they're listening to, we can't possibly be shepherding them as well as we might. That means that we have to make it a point to educate ourselves on the voices that are speaking out there. Which bloggers and writers and teachers, who is it that is generating the content that our women are taking in? So I actually send an email to one of my pastors and say, hey, here's who's new on the radar. You know, we might take a look. Here are some links to some things that they're reading. And I don't pass judgment on them. I just say, here, take a look at this and see. Because I don't expect that my pastors are hanging out on Instagram. In fact, I kind of hope they're not, unless it were for this purpose. Okay, so what voices are women listening to? What messages are they drawn to? There are themes that come up from time to time that women get into, like patterns of prayer or Bible journaling styles or all these kinds of things. What are the things that women are getting into? Are we aware of them? What are the benefits? What are the dangers? How might we incorporate some of this in ways that is edifying versus ways that is tearing down? What are the trends that are in the marketplace that are attracting our women? One of the things, there was an article that came out recently in Christianity Today about multi-level marketing. Did you guys see that? Huge, huge influence on the women in your churches. When I stand up to teach my Bible study every week, I can smell the frankincense rolling off of these women. They have all been heavily anointed in oil. Is it a good thing? Is it a bad thing? It all depends, right? So we need to know what is going on in their lives. If we're going to shepherd them well, we need to know what is influencing them. And then the second point under shepherding them is that we need to keep a top-down buy-in into what is happening in women's ministry. Now, this can be tricky, women. This can be tricky. It can take some effort on your part and some care in how you handle it. But I get emails a lot about women who were leading a women's ministry, which at some point came to be viewed as what we call an ivory tower ministry. Have you heard this term? So in other words, the ministry took on a life of its own. It was operating over here to the side kind of as its own thing, and it didn't have any, or did not seem to have any reference point for what the rest of the church was doing. And it becomes to be seen as adversarial to what the church is trying to accomplish. So how can we avoid this? I want to tell you that it could simply be avoided by having a strong woman leader in place, but that is probably not true. I believe that the Ivory Tower ministry situation happens when there is a breakdown between communication from above and who is running the ministry. So as long as the attitude toward what's going on in the ministry is, hey, just go do that. I don't know what you're doing. Women are, you go do your thing. Then you run into these issues. But that means that if you're the person who's leading the ministry or you're a part of the ministry, you are respectfully and continually inviting whoever is above the ministry into conversation with you, asking for input into what direction the ministry ought to go, showing this is where we're doing this, that, and the other. This is why we chose to do this kind of Bible study versus this kind. This is why we're doing a conference this year instead of a retreat. What do you think about that? Keeping a dialogue open between your upper level of input and the person who is running the ministry. It is essential. It is essential for the well-being of the ministry, and it is essential for those who bear the ultimate responsibility for what is going on in the church to know what is going on and have buy-in into what is going on. So first, women need to be shepherded. We need to know what is influencing them, and we need to keep top-down buy-in into what is happening. And second, women need to be leveraged. Women need to be leveraged. Women are leaving complementarian churches because they believe a theological trade is necessary for them to be able to serve in meaningful roles. I get the emails on a weekly basis. They think that our theology means that they are an afterthought in the life of the church and in the exercise of the Great Commission. I do not believe that is true. If I did, I would not be standing here today advocating for a higher vision. However, we need to make sure that our theology translates into a practice in which women's contributions are so obviously celebrated, needed, and deployed that no one looking in from the outside can cast this comment our way. And I think we probably have some ways to go with that. So, women need to understand and see that their gifts are valued. If Deborah or Huldah were a member of your church, would she have a place to exercise her gifts? What if Kathleen Nielsen were a member of your church? Would there be a place where she could stand up and teach women? Kathleen has a bigger gift than to sit in a room with two women. It doesn't mean that sitting in a room with two women is not a beautiful thing and something that I know Kathleen would do 365 days a year. But she has a bigger gift than that. She has a chance to have a broader impact. Does your church have a place where she can be leveraged, or is the teaching of women an afterthought? Does God give us gifts that are not necessary to the flourishing of the body of believers? I would say no. I think that every gift that God gives is needful, that it is necessary and indispensable. So how can we create environments where women are able to flourish in their gifting? And I think that teaching is the most obvious place that we can see where it can be hard for churches to find places for women. It is not by any stretch the only area where we need to look for more creative ways to employ the gifts of women. But we must actively help women find their places. If we see a woman who has a gift, we as women who are in some position of leadership and influence can help find them, place resources around them so that they are equipped to do what they're doing with excellence in such a way that the commendability of what they're doing is obvious to all. We need to advocate for them. What gifted and able women in your church need your guidance and advocacy. We have to be looking for them. We have to be proactive about identifying and empowering them to take on the role that allows them to use their gifts. And we need to pursue women to serve, not merely say, here is where you may serve, but here is where you must serve, that the life of the church does not go forward as it should unless you are serving. And then we need to lend them credibility by publicly celebrating their gifts. This is something that we as women who have influence can do, and it's something that we can encourage the male leadership in our churches to do as well. They have many people that they are responsible for encouraging and equipping. So it's helpful and good when we can advocate for our sisters in this way. Women need to be leveraged. Third, women need low barriers of participation. Let me explain what I mean by that. Women are typically primary caregivers to at least one other human being. Can I get a witness? So some of you are sitting in this room today on borrowed time, right? You're like, sooner or later, I'm going to have to go home and see what happened while I was gone. And that's okay. Just throw some Cheerios on the floor, lock the door, come back a couple days later, they'll probably be fine. No, it takes a huge amount of effort for women to gather for something like this, but it takes a huge amount of effort for women to gather, period. By the time we are all able to sit down together in a room, many, many other things have had to be taken care of, which is why it is so important to me that when women gather, we value and honor that time. We have to be sure that we use that time well. Now, that means that we want to remove as many barriers to participation as possible when it comes to women's discipleship. That means we do what is called the ministry of more than halfway. We don't say, well, sure, we made something available to you at 6:30 in the morning on a Wednesday. Why didn't you come? Don't you love Jesus? No, we understand that 6:30 a.m. on a Wednesday morning is go time for most women. That's not a good time to schedule a women's Bible study, right? So we try to look at the rhythms of women's lives. We remove that barrier to participation by scheduling it at a time that they can attend. We remove barriers of participation to them coming to mid-sized settings because they need places. Women, remember, we're connectors. This is one of the things that we do that serves the body well. We connect to one another. And so we create mid-sized environments where women can start to form those relationships because that's not something that men really do a whole lot of. They don't get into a room and try to connect all to each other. Do they? Do they do that where you are? I don't see a lot of that. This is a gift that we bring to the church, and we need to facilitate it for women, and we need to make it possible by planning it at times that women are able to attend, and then we need to surround them with resources like childcare and with things like that make it easier for them to walk out the door. We need organic mentoring relationships, and they will be slow to form if we don't provide mid-sized settings. Mid-sized settings are where women cross-pollinate, and they go, oh, I saw you somewhere else. Didn't I see you somewhere else? Oh, maybe I like you. Because here's the deal with organic mentoring relationships. There's another word for them. Friendship. This is a person I like and want to spend time with, and she happens to be at a different stage of life than me. So we look for ways to remove the barriers to participation by giving mid-sized environments where they can meet. Now, we need to gather the input of women on the needs and challenges that they face so that we can make sure that we are properly removing the correct barriers to entry. Depending on the age of the women at your church and the life stage that they're in, they will face different barriers to entry than other women will. Now, a big piece of this is predictability. Women have a high need for predictability. Why? Because they don't have a lot of it, right? And so they need to know that by the time I have made sure that the people to whom I am a primary caregiver are taken care of, and I get myself up here clothed and in my right mind, when I walk in this door, what is waiting for me? I need a high level of certainty that whatever is there waiting for me that you have planned is going to be worth the effort it took for me to come. And if it is, I promise you, they will come and they will come and they will come and they will come. They will invest in what you are doing, but they need a high level of predictability. Think about this. Imagine that you're a young mom and you're in the car with 5 children who are hungry. And they're all about to lose it. And you're driving down the road, and on your left, you see a restaurant you've never been to before, and on your right, you see Chick-fil-A. Yes, Chick-fil-A for 1,000 reasons, but also because it is predictable. Everyone will get what they want and it will be fine. You don't have time. It is too high of a cost for you to go and hope that this other place serves chicken nuggets that are halfway decent. So you go for the predictable thing because your time should be honored. Okay. So the biggest thing, too, that I think women need the church to provide them is opportunities to connect. They just need opportunities to connect because it's what we do. We are connectors. And when we provide these opportunities, whether that's a conference or a retreat or a mid-sized gathering or a weekly women's Bible study or a one-to-one mentoring program, when we offer those opportunities to connect, we are allowing women to form all of these sort of second-tier relationships, right? It's not their primary tier, but it's their second tier. And then what happens when something goes wrong? Someone loses a family member, or someone has a baby, or someone needs help with a family situation. What happens? It's like the spider on the web, right? We tap the web, and all of a sudden, everybody knows. Oh, somebody needs help. This is something we do for the life of the church, and we should facilitate that. Okay, what do we as the church need from women? First, we need their unique perspective. We need their unique perspective, and we need it in 4 key ways. First, the church needs the unique perspective of women in decision-making. Women think differently than men do. Women think differently than men do. When Genesis says that it is not good for the man to be alone, it is speaking specifically to the scene at hand, but I believe it is also speaking a greater truth as well. We need women to have channels of input into decision-making, not just decision-making about women-related topics, but topics that affect the church as a whole. Here's something we need to be mindful of. Research shows that in a group that is split 50-50 gender-wise, okay? So let's say you're having a meeting and there are 5 men and there are 5 women in the meeting. Research tells us that women contribute at significantly lower rates than men do in that setting. So even when there's a balance between the genders in a meeting, check this out, men contribute 2 times as many comments as women do. So that means that whole relational side of the chart that said that men give orders, that men are individual, that men are decision makers, all of that is being inputted into that meeting at 2 times the amount that all of these women connect, women are holistic, women seek consensus, that all of that is entering into a conversation. So that means that sometimes there ought to be meeting rooms in the church that actually have more women than men in them if we're going to find out what's really going on with some of the women's thinking. It's just, think about if it's a 50-50 split and that's what happens in a setting outside of the church. Think what happens to women's participation levels in a meeting in a conservative environment where we're conservative on gender. Many women will never speak at all in a setting like that. So there can be sometimes a false sense in a meeting that because we have brought in a balanced number of participants that we're getting balanced input, but we may not be. So it's important for us to be aware of that. But women's input is needed in decision making. Otherwise, we only get a certain type of decision made every time. Because women think differently. We think in terms of relationships and connections. I would imagine everybody in this room can think of a situation that was made, of a decision that was made either in a room all of women that was a disaster because it was too highly relational, or that was made in a room all of men that was a disaster because it was too focused. It didn't take in other details that were important, right? So there's a danger either way on this that we need to be aware of. We need to look for ways to include women in decision making. Secondly, we need women's perspective in teaching. I am a huge advocate of women teaching women because God does not give unnecessary gifts. When I teach a room full of women, I can say things to them that a man can't. Okay, he can, but they're able to hear them from me in a way that they can't necessarily hear them from him. I can talk to you about your vanity. I can talk to you about gossip and slander. I can talk to you about the sharp answer that you gave to your child that was passive aggressive and you knew it and that child was shredded. I can say those things to you. I can talk to you about how difficult it can be to care for an aging parent. Now, it's not that men have no experience with these things or have nothing to say to these things. It's just that I can relate to you on a level that they can't. And so I can push you on some sin areas that they might not be able to, but also because I have a unique female perspective, then occasionally I'm going to see things in the scripture that might hit me differently than they hit a man. So I was reading 4 different commentaries for something I was working on recently, and they were all 4 written by men. 3 of the men mentioned David and Bathsheba in a way that I would say fit my understanding. One of them referred to David as an adulterer. As a woman, I cannot look at that story of David and Bathsheba and call David an adulterer. That implies that there was some level of consent between he and Bathsheba, and I'm not sure that we can pull that from the text. 3 men said what I just said. One of them didn't. And so I think it's important for us as women to understand that we may have eyes to see that. I don't know that those 3 men didn't have a wife who leaned in and said, I'm pretty sure Bathsheba could not have said no. I'm pretty sure Bathsheba wasn't planning on, hey, I'll go take a bath up here and maybe the king will murder my husband and get me pregnant. So women tend to look on the text from our unique vantage point. It doesn't mean that we feminize the text or make it say something that it doesn't. It just means that sometimes we find an emphasis there that might not otherwise come out. And when we're teaching women, this is a beautiful opportunity to talk about things that might never come up in the gathering of men and women together. It's a beautiful gift. Okay, we need the unique perspective of women in missions, local and abroad. Women have eyes for the widow and the orphan. It's not that men don't. It's just that women, because we understand weakness and helplessness in a way that men may not intuitively get there a little faster. We have eyes to see the defenseless and the underdog perhaps more quickly than men do, and we readily see and respond to the marginalized. Let me give you an example. Who knows when women won the vote in the United States? What year was it? 1920. Good, that's good, 1920. So not even 100 years ago, okay? So 1920, women get the vote. Now, after women win the vote, things like the Family Medical Leave Act, WIC, divorce law, domestic violence laws, and women's health all of a sudden become issues to be dealt with. So listen to this. Maternal and child death in the United States dropped sharply as soon as women got the vote. During World War I, more American women died in childbirth than American men died on the battlefield. Still, the male legislators didn't see it as an important issue until the suffragists made it one. In 1921, the suffragists pushed through the Shepherd-Towner Act, and almost overnight, infant and maternal death rates dropped 16% and 12% respectively. By the time those babies were having babies of their own, maternal fatalities were down over 70%, primarily because of women's ability to influence public policy. How important is it for women to be involved in the way that we are reaching out and addressing widows and orphans issues? Do you know why this is the case, this Shepherd-Towner Act thing is the case? Is it because men are evil and want to keep women down? No. In all of human history, do you know who has never died in childbirth? A man. It's just, we're prisoners of our own experience to a certain extent, and so women need to be welcomed in to these conversations because we have an experience that can shape the church's ability to fulfill the Great Commission. And fourth, we need the perspective of women in the counseling room. In the counseling room, as I've already mentioned, women have eyes for the powerless. Particularly for a woman walking into a counseling room, many times the reason that she is there is because a man has mistreated her, right? This is what we see a lot of times in church settings. And so this woman who already has a distrust of men is asked to walk into a room and tell her story to 3 men, 4 men. Maybe she's brought a friend along because someone said, hey, there ought to be a woman in the room with you, but the friend is also intimidated by the 3 or 4 men who are sitting in the room, and so she stands there and holds her friend's hand, but she doesn't intercede. You know how I know this? Because when I get an email about a counseling session that didn't go well, it's usually from the friend. I was supposed to advocate for her, and I didn't say anything. Why didn't you? Well, there was no level ground. I mean, there wasn't a level ground in that room. So we need to be so careful about the way that we handle. We have to have women who have a voice to speak into the process, who are at the intake level in counseling. Otherwise, there is a huge hazard that we are not doing our duty by women. So I don't know if you know this, but even though women won the vote in 1920, it wasn't until, get this, 1962 that every state in the United States allowed women on juries. Fascinating. In 1962, it was still illegal for a woman to serve on a jury in 3 states. Can you guess which states they were? I'm happy to say that Texas was not one of them. Let's see, it was Mississippi, South Carolina, and Alabama. Women had historically not been allowed to serve on juries because of a legal term called propter defectum sexus. It meant that women had a defect of sex that allowed them to be disqualified from jury duty. They were too delicate to handle what happened in the courtroom. And it was a state-to-state thing, and so it wasn't until 1962 that this was done away with. So there's been all this research has been done on whether it matters whether you have men and women sit on juries. And do you know what the conclusion was? It matters a whole lot. that men and women are different in the way that they perceive cases. So, for example, with regard to cases of rape and spousal murder, the study found that the gender of jurors bore a marked influence on the legal process in mock trials. Jurors favored defendants of their own sex in their judgments of whether a defendant murdered his or her spouse. Women were more likely than men to feel empathy for the defendant and to request he or she receive psychiatric care. Women were more likely to find the male defendant guilty in rape cases, while men tended to shift blame to the victim. Female jurors were more likely to see battered wife syndrome, in other words, I killed my husband because he was abusing me, were more likely to see battered wife syndrome as a credible defense in spousal murder cases. They were also more likely to affiliate with underdogs and minorities. Men were found to assign longer jail sentences to less physically attractive people, while attractiveness did not impact the sentences assigned by women. So do you know what the courts realized? Men and women are not interchangeable. The report actually said that they fulfill a, get this, complementary role. We need both of those voices in any room where judgment is being passed. Please hear me. So important that the influence of women be felt in the counseling room. So that meant that in 1962, if a woman was tried for the murder of her husband and she claimed spousal abuse, she would have been tried by a jury of 12 men. Would you want to be that woman? And I don't think men are out to get me or hate me or anything. I just would want there to be a woman on that jury, someone who knew she could speak into the process. So in the counseling room, it's so important for us to have women there. They have eyes to see the powerless. Okay, so first we need the influence of women. Second, we need their relational capital. As I mentioned, women are connectors. They are connectors to one another. They are connectors to, they connect families to the church, and they connect friends to the church. So we need that to be happening for the church to be a healthy place. Third, we need the visible leadership of women. As visible as your church's view of complementarianism allows, that is how visible we need women to be. Why? Because our daughters need to see examples like Kathleen Nielsen opening up the Bible and rightly dividing the Word of God. Our daughters need to see women who are reaching out to help the widow and the orphan. Our daughters need to see women who are offering help on how to parent and raise children well. Our daughters need it, and here's the thing, so do our sons. Our sons need to understand a strong vision of womanhood every bit as much as our daughters do as well. Otherwise, the church will not function as it should. The more restrictively you read the scriptures with regard to gender roles, the more focus I believe you should give to cultivating women leaders in the area that your interpretation allows. One of the things I just want to caution you on, I'm over my time, so I'm going to move quickly, is this groups model that everybody's going to, where, we're just going to do groups. That's really all we need in our church. It's going to be awesome. Guess what happens when you go to a groups model? There's an unintended gender bias that comes along with it, okay? Because what happens is, first of all, ways that women can be involved in the life of the church in a leadership role start to really die off pretty quickly, because usually a pure groups model means we have mixed gender groups that meet, and if you're a single woman, you can be in a single gender group, and if you're a single man, you can be in a single gender group. But here's what happens. What are small groups good for? Like, what's the thing they're really good at? Building community, right? Relationships, okay, great. What are they really awful for? Teaching, right? A teaching environment, they're really hard for that. Anybody want to argue that? I think it's really, really, yeah, you're all nodding your heads. Okay, so think about this for a second. I teach women the Bible. My push on women all the time is you are called to love God, not just with your feelings, but with your mind. That's the thing that is hard for women. What is easy for women? Building relationships. What's hard for men? Building. What's easy for men? Sitting and listening to teaching, loving God with their minds. So when we go to a pure groups model, what do? We push on the thing that's hard for men all the time. And we don't push on the thing that's hard for women at all. Women come to home group, they fit in, they connect, they look at their husband, he doesn't want to be there. Why? Because men would rather slam their head into a wall than come into a room and share their deeper secrets with others. And they're like, he's bad at church. He's bad at church and I'm awesome at it. So just be really careful as you look at those. We need more than just apples in the fruit basket. We need apples and oranges. We need environments that push men on what's hard. We need environments that push women on what's hard as well. Okay, my final point. What does the church need from women? We need them in paid staff positions. Women are great at team building. They're great at relationship building, consensus, collaboration, all of those things. Those are things that are valuable to a church staff. But too often our strongest women leaders remain volunteers in roles that are worthy of pay. The worker is worthy of her wages and we should pay her. If I were to ask you what it was that you valued, like what do you value? How would I know? I would look at your checkbook and I would look at your calendar. The same is true of churches. If we were to look at the church's budget and the church's calendar, would it demonstrate that we believe that it is equally important for men to flourish as it is for women to flourish? It doesn't mean that half your budget is devoted to women's ministry. No, it doesn't. But it means that we are prioritizing calendar and budget to cultivate this unique thing that women have and share with one another. This may require us to embrace hiring practices that are more creative in nature and less corporate. So the corporate world does not care whether I am having children. The corporate world just wants me to fit into its model, although actually many corporations are getting better at this. So I spoke at a church a couple weeks ago. They employ women full-time at 30 hours a week, full benefits, and summers off. And I said, "You've got to be kidding me. Are you hiring?" I said, "Why do you do that?" And they said, "Because it became apparent to us that if we didn't do something like that, we would only be able to hire single women or empty nesters, and we feel like we need input from a broader spectrum of women in the church." So they've adjusted their hire. I'm currently in a job share with another woman at my church. They wanted to hire me full-time, but I'm not at a point in my life where I could commit to it. And so they hired 2 women and we split the responsibilities. There are creative ways to make sure that women are a part of the life of the church, but it may also require us to rethink some of our ingrained ideas about men and women working together. So for example, a position is open on the church staff. The supervisor is a man. He is interviewing a man and a woman for the job. He interviews the woman. She's qualified. She's great. Both candidates are equally qualified. But if he hires the man, he can meet with him more easily. He can travel with him. He can put him on a trajectory to become a pastor, all of these things. And so what's he going to do? He's going to hire the man. Now, it's not that that is the wrong decision, but it's worth asking the question when these decisions come up, is this a role that a woman could fill where it would benefit the life of the church in such a way that we're going to prioritize putting her there? So there are issues with women's ministry that the church needs to come to terms with if we are going to deploy women to be co-rulers, co-heirs, co-participants in the Great Commission. And they might require us to stretch ourselves a little bit on our thinking, but don't think for a minute that it's our theology that has to bend here. It's a question of philosophy and practice. And what I'm asking of you is that as you're able to have influence, you would talk about these things. You would think about these things. How can we look at our church and say, what do we need? Do we need women's Bible study? I would say yes every time. Just spoiler alert. Yes, don't cut that. Do we need a conference? Do we need a mid-sized environment? Do we need a mentoring program? What are the pieces that we need for the place that we are? How can we best equip and deploy our women? And then how can we be a church that models this thing of men and women serving alongside each other, brothers and sisters, sons and daughters, man and woman side by side moving forward to accomplish the Great Commission? I am for you. I pray that your churches would be places where men and women flourish and the gospel is magnified. Let's pray. Heavenly Father, I thank you for each woman here and for the sphere of influence you have placed her in. I pray that these words today would be an encouragement to those who have perhaps thought on some of these things before they have come. I pray, Lord, that the church would be a place where your sons and your daughters rise up and speak boldly words of truth and live lives that shout the gospel. And we ask all these things in Jesus' name. Amen.